Somewhere in a monastery library, sometime around the year 1150, a monk named Aelred sat down and wrote about love between men. Not lust, love. He called it spiritual friendship, and he said it was one of the highest forms of devotion a soul could offer God. He wrote it while running one of the most respected abbeys in England. He wrote it as a celibate monk, sworn to chastity, describing bonds between brothers that he compared to fire, to marriage, to the closest thing a human being could feel to another human being. And nobody burned the manuscript. It survived. It was copied, read, taught, passed from monastery to monastery for centuries. Here's the question that should stop you cold. How does a society that we assume hated homosexuality on sight produce a monk who wrote something like that in a monastery with the abbot's blessing in a book still read by novices generations later? The answer is stranger, sadder, and more human than anything you were taught in school. This is the story of what it meant to be a man who loved men inside the medieval church, an institution that simultaneously created some of the only spaces where two men could live together, sleep near each other, share a life bound by intimacy and purpose, and also built the legal and theological machinery that would eventually send men like them to the fire. It is a story with no single hero and no single villain, because the same walls that sheltered these men were built by the same hands that, in another century, would tear them down. Let's set the scene properly. Medieval Europe, roughly the 11th through the 15th centuries. This is not one uniform culture. It's a patchwork of kingdoms, dialects, and local customs stitched together by one shared authority that towered over all of it, the Catholic Church. And the Church had a complicated, shifting, often contradictory relationship with sex between men. In the earliest medieval centuries, punishments existed on paper in documents called penitentials, handbooks that priests used to assign penance for confessed sins. Sex between men was listed among many transgressions, alongside gluttony, drunkenness, and adultery. Enforcement was inconsistent. Penance was often just that, a private penance, a set of prayers or a fast, not a public spectacle, not a trial, not a fire. Sex between men was a sin to be confessed, not necessarily a crime to be prosecuted. That distinction matters enormously because it created a grey zone. And grey zones are where people learn to survive. Monasteries sat right in the middle of that grey zone. Think about what a monastery actually was. Hundreds of men, sometimes as young as 7 or 8 years old when they entered as oblates, living together for their entire lives, sharing dormitories, sharing labour in the fields and the scriptorium, sharing meals, prayers, grief, illness, old age. Marriage to women was not an option, not a temptation, not even a category of thought for most of them. Emotional lives had to be built entirely within an all-male world, and they had to be built to last 50, 60 years, because a monk who entered at 7 might still be alive and cloistered at 70. Historians studying monastic rules have noted something telling. Monastery regulations spent an unusual amount of energy trying to prevent particular friendships, private meetings, one monk sitting too close to another, two men whispering in the dark of a shared dormitory, pairs of brothers who always seemed to volunteer for the same chores. Why would you need a rule like that unless the thing you were forbidding was already happening, again and again, in monastery after monastery, across different countries and different centuries? So picture our monk. We'll call him Brother Anselm, not because he was necessarily a real named individual whose private life survives intact in the historical record, but because his experience represents thousands of men just like him. Men whose names were never written down, whose inner lives left no trace except in the rules built to contain them. He enters the monastery young. Maybe his family couldn't afford a dowry for every son. Maybe he was a second or third boy with no land to inherit. Maybe, and this happened more than people assume, he chose it himself because a life devoted to God and books and brotherhood sounded better than a life devoted to a wife he was expected to want and never quite did. Maybe his parents noticed something in him, some difference they didn't have words for, and the monastery was simply the quiet, respectable solution medieval families reached for when a son didn't fit the expected shape of a life. Inside those walls, he finds something he didn't expect. He finds another brother, someone he works beside in the fields, someone he sits across from during silent meals, someone whose voice during the night prayers, the ones sung in darkness before dawn, does something to his chest he doesn't have language for. Medieval people didn't have the word gay. They didn't organize identity around desire the way we do, but they absolutely had the experience. They had it, and they wrote about it in letters between monks that survive to this day, letters using language so intimate, so charged, that modern historians still argue over how literally to read them. One letter, from a monk to a companion who had been transferred to another house, describes lying awake, picturing his friend's face, describes a longing so physical the writer says his whole body aches with it. Some scholars call it spiritual language borrowed for close friendship. Others point out that the line between deep devotional friendship and romantic love was, for these men, often not a line at all, and that maybe we are the ones imposing a boundary that never existed for them. Here's the twist most documentaries skip past. The church didn't just tolerate intense male bonds inside monasteries. In certain forms, it celebrated them, ritualized them, gave them ceremony. There's a long tradition, documented across the Mediterranean world, of sworn brotherhood, a formal, sometimes liturgical ceremony where two men would pledge lifelong loyalty to each other in front of a priest, sometimes at the altar, sometimes using rites that echoed marriage vows almost word for word, hands joined, a blessing spoken over them, sometimes even a shared cup afterward. Historians disagree, sometimes fiercely, about what these ceremonies meant to the people involved. Some argue it was purely about kinship and mutual protection, a medieval version of a business partnership sealed in sacred language. Others argue that for at least some of these men, the bond was romantic in every sense we'd recognize today, and that the church provided the only legitimate framework available for two men to formalize a life together. What's not in dispute is this. The medieval world had a category for intense, exclusive, lifelong devotion between men, and it did not automatically read that devotion as sin. So if there was space for that, where did the danger come from? It came from Rome, it came from theology, and it came decisively from a shift that happened in the 12th and 13th centuries, a shift historians consider one of the great turning points in the history of sexuality in the West. Before that period, church law treated sex between men mostly the way it treated other sexual sins, seriously, but as one item on a long list, weighed against dozens of other moral failings a person might confess. After that period, something changed. Theologians began describing sex between men not just as a sin, but as a crime against nature itself, something that placed the sinner outside the natural order entirely, closer to bestiality in the moral hierarchy than to ordinary lust. A monk named Peter Damian, writing in the 11th century, produced a furious treatise called the Book of Gomorrah, condemning what he saw happening inside monasteries, describing a network of men protecting each other, absolving each other in confession, covering for one another so thoroughly that the sin, in his words, spread like an infection through entire religious houses. He sent it straight to the Pope, demanding a crackdown, demanding that offending monks be stripped of rank and publicly shamed. The fact that he felt the need to write it at all tells you something. He wasn't warning about a hypothetical. He was describing something he believed was already widespread, organized, and quietly tolerated by the very men in charge of policing it. And notably, the Pope who received it did not order the sweeping punishments Damien demanded. He softened them. Even at the highest level of the Church, there was hesitation about turning that tension between the reality of what was happening in monastic life and the fury of reformers determined to stamp it out is the real engine of this story. Because for every Aelred writing tenderly about brotherhood, there was a Peter Damien demanding blood, and for every quiet abbey that let two devoted brothers grow old together, there was a reforming bishop somewhere else building the case for annihilation. By the year 1215, the reformers won a major victory. The Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most consequential church gatherings of the entire Middle Ages, hardened church law across Europe, tightening confession requirements, increasing surveillance of clergy, sharpening the language used to define sexual sin. In the decades that followed, secular kingdoms began writing their own laws, borrowing the Church's language of unnatural acts and building it into criminal codes with actual, physical, terrifying penalties. By the 13th and 14th centuries, in parts of Italy, France, and Spain, the penalty on paper was death, frequently by burning. In some regions, the law specified burning at the stake explicitly, sometimes alongside heretics, sometimes alone, as though the crime deserved a category of destruction all its own. Let's sit with that for a second, because it's easy to let it become just a historical fact and slide past it. Burning was not chosen at random. In medieval symbolic thinking, fire purified, it was the same punishment reserved for heretics, people whose beliefs were considered so dangerous they threatened to corrupt everyone around them. By classifying sex between men the same way, the law wasn't just saying, this is illegal. It was saying, this person's existence is a contagion, and only fire can cleanse it. That's the machinery Brother Anselm was living inside. Not just a rule against an act, a belief system that, if it turned its full force on him, would treat his very nature as something to be burned out of the world, in front of a crowd, as a lesson to everyone watching. But here's the part the fire and brimstone version of this story usually leaves out. Prosecution was rare, shockingly rare, relative to how severe the laws were on paper. Historians who've combed through surviving court records from cities like Florence, Venice, and Bologna, cities that kept unusually detailed records, specifically because they created special courts to police male sexuality, have found something that upends the popular image entirely. In Florence, the Font's one specialized office, known as the Officers of the Night, spent 70 years, from the 1430s to the 1500s, prosecuting cases. The number of men implicated ran into the thousands, out of a city with a population of only around 40,000. Historians studying these records estimate that at various points, a majority of Florentine men had been named at least once in an accusation before turning 40. Read that again. Not a fringe minority, a documented, staggering portion of the ordinary male population, merchants, apprentices, priests, fathers of families, named in official records for relationships with other men, and most of them were fined, warned, or released, not executed. The law on paper said fire. The law in practice, most of the time, said fine and go home, sin no more, and try not to get caught a third time. That gap between the written law and the lived reality is where men like Brother Anselm found room to breathe. Monasteries in particular operated partly outside the reach of secular courts. A monk accused of misconduct was often handled internally through confession, penance, transfer to a different house, quiet correction, rather than being handed to a civil magistrate who might apply the full weight of secular law. That internal system could be brutal in its own way, involving isolation, fasting, humiliation before the whole community. But it could also be a shield. An abbot who valued a brilliant, devoted monk, a skilled copyist, a gifted singer, a capable administrator, had every incentive to handle a problem quietly rather than destroy a member of his own community and invite scandal down on the whole abbey. Reputation mattered. Scandal threatened donations, threatened the standing of the house among other monasteries, threatened the abbot's own position. Silence was often simply more practical than severity. So imagine Brother Anselm again, years into his life at the monastery. He has built something with another monk, call him Brother Thomas, that neither of them has words for, not in any language available to them. They pray beside each other. They copy manuscripts by candlelight, their hands sometimes brushing over the same page, their shoulders close enough to feel the other's warmth in a cold stone room. They understand, without ever needing to say it aloud, that discovery could end everything: expulsion, public shame, in the worst case, transfer to the mercy of a bishop with no patience for quiet arrangements. And still, they stay. Still, they build a life inside the only structure medieval society offered them where two men could share a home, a purpose, decades of a single life, without a wife, without children, without ever having to explain why. They grow old together in the same cloister, walk the same worn stone path between chapel and dormitory for 40 years, and are, in the end, buried a short distance apart in the same monastery cemetery, their names carved by the same mason, their graves tended by the same brothers who never asked questions they didn't want answered. Was it love in the way we'd use the word today? We cannot know for certain, and historians rightly resist the urge to project modern identity backward onto people who didn't think about themselves the way we do. But we can know this. The emotional and physical closeness these men shared was real, documented, and in some cases openly celebrated by the very institution that, elsewhere, called it an abomination worthy of death. That contradiction isn't a footnote. It is the story. What happened to men like this, in the end? It depended entirely on time, place, and luck, a lottery none of them could control. Some lived out full lives inside their monasteries, dying old, buried with honor, their private world never disturbed by the outside one, remembered by their brothers as devoted, learned, gentle men. Some were caught in the machinery of reform, expelled, shamed, sent to do penance in isolation for years, stripped of the only community they had ever known. And some, in the worst documented cases, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, when prosecutions intensified in certain regions, were handed over to secular authorities and executed, sometimes specifically because they were clergy, because the church wanted to make an example of exactly the kind of man it had, for centuries, quietly permitted to exist within its own walls. There is a grim irony in that. The very visibility that came with being a man of God, a person whose conduct was supposed to model virtue for an entire community, could turn a quiet monk into a very public warning. The hypocrisy wasn't incidental, it was structural. The same institution that gave these men one of the only safe harbors available to them also built the theology and the law that could, without warning, turn that harbor into a trap. It's worth pausing here to ask why this history isn't better known. Part of the answer is simple. The record is fragmentary by design. Confession was private. Penance was private. The men who lived quiet, undiscovered lives left almost no trace, precisely because they succeeded in staying hidden, which means the surviving record is skewed toward the failures, the scandals, the trials, the executions, the cases where secrecy broke down. That skew has shaped how we imagine this history. We inherit the loud stories of persecution because those are the ones that generated paperwork, court records, sermons of condemnation. The quiet stories, the decades of ordinary devoted companionship, mostly vanish because nobody wrote down what didn't need explaining. That absence is its own kind of evidence. It tells us that for every man burned, there were likely dozens, perhaps hundreds, who were never even suspected, who lived their entire lives in the grey zone we've been describing, protected by silence, by discretion, by an institution that, whatever its official doctrine, often preferred not to look too closely at its own walls. So what does this story actually reveal about the Middle Ages once you strip away the assumptions? It reveals that medieval society was never the flat, uniformly hostile monolith we imagine when we picture the Dark Ages as a single block of ignorance and cruelty. It had grey zones, quiet tolerances, entire institutions that functioned, whether by design or by accident, as refuges for men who had nowhere else to build a life. It also had extraordinary cruelty, a legal and theological system capable of turning a person's most private truth into a capital crime, capable of building fire into the very definition of justice. Both of those things were true at the same time, often in the same building, sometimes in the same decade, sometimes enforced by the very same men who, in another context, might have looked the other way. History rarely hands us a clean moral. It hands us contradictions and asks us to sit with them, uncomfortable as that sitting might be. Somewhere in an archive, there is still a manuscript with two names written into its margins, side by side, in the same hand, from nearly 1,000 years ago. We will never know exactly what those two men meant to each other. But someone, centuries before we had the words to describe it, needed to write those names down together, in a place he thought no one else would ever read. Maybe that's the real inheritance history leaves us. Not certainty, just the quiet evidence that people have always found each other, in every age, under every law, whether the world was ready for it or not. And perhaps that is the truest thing we can say about them. Long before the words existed to name what they were, they had already found each other in the only silence